Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Here's sad news to report today on the passing of one of the pioneers of the Neo Soul genre of music, the Godfather, as it were, of the Neo Soul movement. D'Angelo has passed away at the age of 51 from pancreatic cancer. Uh, now, this is incredibly sad for his I believe he has one child. He has one son with Angie Stone. We talked about Angie Stone way back in March when she herself passed away. And, you know, if that's not incredibly tragic, yet incredibly poetic, I don't know what is, because these two were in love. These two were soulmates. And they were both influential, like we said, in the neo soul movement, moving R&B in that direction in the early '90s, and now they are both no longer here with us. Let's talk a little bit about D'Angelo's career. Um, he started. Uh, he was born in Richmond, Virginia, to a Pentecostal family, so a deeply religious family. And by the time he was 18 years old, he started to come to New York City to compete in amateur night at the Apollo, right? And he was doing pretty well, but he didn't end up being successful in that. But he eventually moved to New York City to pursue his musical career. And by 1991, he had formed a super group with the likes of Usher, Brian McKnight, and a few others called Black Men United. And this kind of group had a different kind of sound, emphasizing elements of funk, elements of classical soul from the '60s and '70s, Gamble and Huff type stuff, um, Parliament Funkadelic type vocals, a lot of Jimi Hendrix, a lot of Sly and the Family Stone, a lot of that sort of sound and look. And this particular sound was pioneered by an executive at Motown Records by the name of Kedar Massenberg, who R&B of the 1980s had become really commercialized. You know, it corresponded with a change in mainstream African American acceptability. As African Americans began to move into the cultural mainstream, whereas before in the '60s, in the '50s, '60s, and '70s, African Americans, Black Americans had been on the cultural outskirts. So the music had been more rebellious and more against the grain type stuff. This is where we get the soul, this, you know, early 1970s soul. Like I said, the Gamble and Huff type music, and you get funk music. But by the 1980s, that all changed. Michael Jackson was super polished. Anita Baker was super polished. Prince was mainstream. But with Kader Massenberg, he wanted to move the music by the 90s, wanted to move the music back to its cultural roots, give it a more of an edge. Because one of the things that also happened was that R&B was faced with a tremendous challenge of hip hop. Hip hop had come onto the scene, and hip hop was the new vanguard of artistic expression in Black culture, different than R&B, with a much more edge. So R&B kind of lost its edge in the '80s, but Kedar Massenberg wanted to bring it back by revitalizing some of the rebellious and socially conscious lyrics, and taking from hip hop, which also had a socially conscious strain in itself, and create an R&B twin to that. So an R&B companion of, say, the type of music like De La Soul or Tribe Called Quest in hip hop. Kader Massenberg, and pioneered by D'Angelo and Angie Stone and Jill Scott and Erica Badu, wanted to create an R&B an R&B counterpart to that. The same sort of social consciousness and social awareness that that type of that subgenre of hip hop was having. They wanted to have it too in R&B. So they began to D'Angelo began to work on that, and out of that came uh, his 1995 um, hit "Brown Sugar," which was a seminal release. You know that it really was an underground hit, to be honest, because the mainstream really wasn't ready for it, but it did, you know, create a stir within R&B. But I think really when he took his stride was in the late '90s and early 2000s with the un, untitled video slash How Does It Feel, because here he took sexuality and he brought it to another level. I mean, basically, he was in a video where he appeared shirtless, right? And there were rumors going around that he was not only shirtless, that he was bottomless, you know, at the bottom. And everybody, especially girls, you know what I mean, was looking to see, you know, if they could catch a peek of him. And he was, you know, this kind of sex symbol, but at the same time, this really artsy kind of socially conscious sort of sex symbol, differently than a lot of mainstream R&B artists at the time. You know, and his first album, the 1995, what I was saying, you know, Brown Sugar was like different as far as instrumentally. You know, a lot of instrumentation because, like I said, the neo soul artists took from a lot of the conscious hip hop artists, and they were kind of feeding off each other. So groups like the Roots also, you know, were highly influential when it came to him. You know, and they play live instrumental music. Rappers like Common, for example, they were all kind of ran in a lot of the same social circles. Raphael Sadiq, from Tony, all kind of ran in the same sort of social circles of this neo soul slash conscious hip hop type vibe. And then after that, he stood out of the public eye for about nearly a decade. You know, focusing on himself and focusing on, you know, his relationship with Angie and his personal life, right? And then and finally in 2014 he released the album Black Messiah, which went on to get win 2 Grammy awards. His brother Luther was also an accomplished musician, and they they released a song on the 1994 movie Jason Lyric, uh, on the soundtrack to that movie called How Will You Know, which like peaked in the top 10 of the Billboard charts, you know, that year. But like I said, a lot of people will remember him from that video. How does it feel? Unentitled, because that one there got a lot of guys jealous and a lot of women excited because it was selling sex in a sort of not a trashy way, but a really seductive sort of way, differently than in the mainstream. So, like he never really achieved the kind of success that warranted his type of artistry, just because he was so ahead of his time. You know what I mean? He was extremely ahead of his time. He typified a real vision, even in the beginning, like with Black Men United. You know, uniting all these other R&B artists to create this sort of supergroup was something that you didn't really see. You know, collaborations in music wasn't really a thing. You know, when he started this group. You know, and it's just sad to see for his son, losing both his parents, in the same calendar year. 2025 has to be um, terrible for his family, but it's really poetic to think of their relationship and what we said before in the video about Angie Stone, what she meant to the neo soul movement and what she was doing on the women's side was something similar, bringing a sort of sexy sophistication to the women without being, overtly trashy or anything, and defying a lot of the stereotypes that are associated with black female artists in popular culture. He was sort of doing the same thing within the male superstructure. So he definitely will be missed. When I think of somebody like him, like Brown Sugar is one of my favorite songs. You know, from him, um, and he definitely moved um, the artistic side of R&B in another direction because neo soul was so cool when that era, you know, really got into fruition. It started in the early 90s, like I said, but it really became big in the late 90s, where uh, you had Alicia Keys was feeding into it, Jill Scott was feeding into it, Music Soul Child, and of course Angie Stone and D'Angelo. And it was like it was associated with this sort of black bohemian aesthetic, knitted caps, colorful clothing, sort of uh, late 60s, early 70s mystique, retro mystique that was feeding into it. This sort of high intellectualism, infused into R&B, you know, calling back to the roots of R&B and B and the funk and the soul era of R&B. And it was cool, man. It was a cool aesthetic, and I was into it, and I loved it, and I love being a part of it and listening to that sort of type of music because it called back to the roots of African American music, not just soul and funk, obviously, like I said, but also jazz and deeper versions of the blues. So knowing that he had Southern roots and he had roots in the black church, um, makes a lot of sense to me. But anyway, rest in peace to D'Angelo, and thank you to him and and the contributions that he made with his music. And I just feel like he was one of the real unsung heroes of R&B, of that era, because he was so ahead of his time for the things that he did. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you guys. Like I said, I was a huge fan, especially of a lot of his early stuff, because like I said, I heard a lot of Prince in him. I heard a lot of Sly and the Family Stone in him. Uh, all of those influences, coming out through his music, back then, really a retro style of music. And, you know, it's something you don't really see nowadays in R&B at all when it comes to male R&B vocalist. You don't even see a male R&B vocalist. But he was a tremendous vocalist, and he was able, like I said, to use sexuality without a way of being overly salacious, but really classy with it as well.